Chapter 13. Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Dead Men's Money by J. S. Fletcher. Chapter 13. Sir Gilbert Carstairs. It was probably with a notion of justifying my present course of procedure to myself that during that ride I went over the reasons which had kept my tongue quiet up to that time, and now led me to go to Sir Gilbert Carstairs. Why I had not told the police nor Mr. Lindsey of what I had seen, I have already explained. My own natural caution and reserve made me afraid of saying anything that might cast suspicion on an innocent man, and also I wanted to await developments. I was not concerned much with that feature of the matter, but I had undergone some qualms because I had not told Maisie Dunlop, for ever since the time at which she and I had come to a serious and sober understanding, it had been a settled thing between us that we would never have any secrets from each other. Why, then, had I not told her of this? That took a lot of explaining afterwards, when things so turned out that it would have been the best thing ever I did in my life if I only had confided in her. But this explanation was, after all, to my credit. I did not tell Maisie because I knew that, taking all the circumstances into consideration, she would fill herself with doubts and fears for me, and would for ever be living in an atmosphere of dread lest I, like Phillips, should be found with a knife thrust in me. So much for that. It was in Maisie's own interest. And why, after keeping silence to everybody, did I decide to break it to Sir Gilbert Carstairs? There, Andrew Dunlop came in, of course, unawares to himself, for in those lecturings that he was so fond of giving us young folk, there was a moral precept of his kept cropping up, which he seemed to set great store by. If you've anything against a man, or reason to mistrust him, he would say, don't keep it to yourself, or hint it to other people behind his back, but go straight to him and tell him to his face, and have it out with him. He was a wise man, Andrew Dunlop, as all his acquaintance knew, and I felt that I could do no better than take a lesson from him in this matter. So I would go straight to Sir Gilbert Carstairs, and tell him what was on my mind, let the consequences be what they might. It was well after sunset, and the gloaming was over the hills and the river, when I turned into the grounds of Hathercleugh, and looked round me at a place which, though I had lived close to it ever since I was born, I had never set foot in before. The house stood on a plateau of ground high above Tweed, with a deep shawl of wood behind it and a fringe of plantations on either side. House and pleasure grounds were enclosed by a high ivied wall on all sides. You could see little of either until you were within the gates. It looked, in that evening light, a romantic and picturesque old spot, and one in which you might well expect to see ghosts, or fairies, or the like. The house itself was something between an 18th-century mansion and an old border fortress. Its centre part was very high in the roof, and had turrets, with outer stairs to them at the corners. The parapets were embattled, and in the turrets were arrow slits. But romantic as the place was, there was nothing gloomy about it, and as I passed to the front, between the grey walls and a sunk balustered garden that lay at the foot of a terrace, I heard through the open windows of one brilliantly lighted room, the click of billiard balls and the sound of men's light-hearted laughter, and through another the notes of a piano. There was a grand butler man met at the hall door, and looked sourly at me as I leaned my bicycle against one of the pillars and made up to him. He was sourer still when I asked to see his master, and he shook his head at me, looking me up and down as if I were some undesirable. "You can't see Sir Gilbert at this time of the evening," said he. "What do you want?" "Will you tell Sir Gilbert that Mr. Moneylaws, clerk to Mr. Lindsey, solicitor, wishes to see him on important business," I answered, looking him hard in the face. "I think he'll be quick to see me when you give him that message." He stared and growled at me a second or two before he went off with an ill grace, leaving me on the steps. But, as I had expected, he was back almost at once, and beckoning me to enter and follow him. And follow him I did, past more flunkeys who stared at me as if I had come to steal the silver, and through soft-carpeted passages to a room in which he led me with small politeness. "You're to sit down and wait," he said gruffly. "Sir Gilbert will attend to you presently." He closed the door on me, and I sat down and looked around. I was in a small room that was filled with books from floor to ceiling, big books and little, in fine leather bindings, and the gilt of their letterings and labels shining in the rays of a tall lamp that stood on a big desk in the centre. It was a fine room that, with everything luxurious in the way of furnishings and appointments. You could have sunk your feet in the warmth of the carpets and rugs, and there were things in it for comfort and convenience that I had never heard tell of. I had never been in a rich man's house before, and the grandeur of it, the idea that it gave one of wealth, made me feel that there's a vast gulf fixed between them that have and them that have not. And in the middle of these philosophies the door suddenly opened, and in walked Sir Gilbert Carstairs, and I stood up and made my politest bow to him. He nodded affably enough, and he laughed as he nodded. "Oh," said he, "Mr. Moneylaws, I've seen you before, at that inquest the other day, I think, didn't I?" "That is so, Sir Gilbert," I answered. "I was there with Mr. Lindsey." "Why, of course, and you gave evidence," he said. "I remember. Well, and what did you want to see me about, Mr. Moneylaws?" "Will you smoke a cigar?" he went on, picking up a box from the table and holding it out to me. "Help yourself." "Thank you, Sir Gilbert," I answered, "but I haven't started that yet." "Well, then, I will," he laughed, and he picked out a cigar, lighted it, and flinging himself into an easy-chair, motioned me to take another exactly opposite to him. "Now then, fire away," he said. "Nobody'll interrupt us, and my time's yours. You've some message for me?" I took a good look at him before I spoke. He was a big, fine, handsome man, some 55 years of age, I should have said, but uncommonly well preserved, a clean-shaven, powerful-faced man, with quick eyes and a very alert glance. Maybe, if there was anything struck me particularly about him, it was the rapidity and watchfulness of his glances, the determination in his square jaw, and the extraordinary strength and whiteness of his teeth. He was quick at smiling, and quick, too, in use of his hands, which were always moving as he spoke, as if to emphasize whatever he said. And he made a very fine and elegant figure as he sat there in his grand evening clothes, and I was puzzled to know which struck me most, the fact that he was what he was, the 7th baronet, and head of an old family, or the familiar, easy, good-natured fashion which he treated me, and talked to me, as if I had been a man of his own rank. I had determined what to do as I sat waiting him, and now that he had bidden me to speak, I told him the whole story from start to finish, beginning with Gilverthwaite, and ending with Crone, and sparing no detail or explanation of my own conduct. He listened in silence, and with more intentness and watchfulness than I had ever seen a man show in my life, and now and then he nodded and sometimes smiled, and when I had made an end he put a sharp question. "So, beyond Crone, who, I hear, is dead, you've never told a living soul of this?" he asked, eyeing me closely. "No one, Sir Gilbert," I assured him. "Not even—" "Not even who?" he inquired quickly. "Not even my own sweetheart," I said, "and it's the first secret ever I kept from her." He smiled at that, and gave me a quick look as if he were trying to get a fuller idea of me. "Well," he said, "and you did right. Not that I should care two pins, Mr. Moneylaws, if you told all this out at the inquest, but suspicion is easily aroused, and it spreads, like wildfire, and I'm a stranger, as if it were, in this country so far, and these people might think things that I wouldn't have them think, and, in short, I'm much obliged to you, and I'll tell you frankly, as you've been frank with me, how I came to be at those crossroads at that particular time and on that particular night. It's a simple explanation, and could be easily corroborated, if need be. I suffer from a disturbing form of insomnia, sleeplessness. It's a custom of mine to go long walks late at night. Since I came here, I've been out that way almost every night, as my servants could assure you. I walk, as a rule, from 9 o'clock to 12, to induce sleep, and on that night I'd been miles and miles out towards Yetholm, and back, and when you saw me with my map and electric torch, I was looking for the nearest turn home. I'm not too well acquainted with the border yet," he concluded with a flash of his white teeth, "and I have to carry a map with me, and that's how it was, and that's all." I rose out of my chair at that. He spoke so readily and ingenuously that I had no more doubt of the truth of what he was saying than I had of my own existence. "Then it's all for me, too, Sir Gilbert," said I. "I shan't say a word more of the matter to anybody. It's as if it never existed. I was thinking all the time there'd be an explanation of it, so I'll be bidding you good night." "Sit you down again a minute," said he, pointing to the easy chair. "No need for hurry. You're a clerk to Mr. Lindsey, the solicitor?" "I am that," I answered. "Are you articled to him?" he asked. "No," said I. "I am an ordinary clerk of 7 years' standing." "Plenty of experience of office work and routine?" he inquired. "Aye," I replied. "No end of that, Sir Gilbert." "Are you good at figures and accounts?" he asked. "I've kept all Mr. Lindsey's, and a good many trust accounts, for the last 5 years," I answered, wondering what all this was about. "In fact, you're thoroughly well up in all clerical matters?" he suggested. "Keeping books, writing letters, all that sort of thing?" "I can honestly say I'm a past master in everything of that sort," I affirmed. He gave me a quick glance, as if he were sizing me up altogether. "Well, I'll tell you what, Mr. Moneylaws," he said. "The fact is, I'm wanting a sort of steward, and it strikes me that you're just the man I'm looking for." End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Carl. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 14. I was so much amazed by this extraordinary suggestion that for the moment I could only stand staring at him, and before I could find my tongue he threw a quick question at me. "Lindsay wouldn't stand in your way, would he?" asked. "Such jobs don't go begging, you know." "Mr. Lindsay wouldn't stand in my way, Sir Gilbert," I answered, "but—" "But what?" he said, seeing me hesitate. "Is it a post you wouldn't care about, then? There's $500 a year with it, and a permanency." Strange as it may seem, considering all the circumstances, it never occurred to me for one moment that the man was buying my silence, buying me. There wasn't the ghost of such a thought in my head. I let out what was there in my next words. "I'd like such a post fine, Sir Gilbert," I said. "What I'm thinking of, could I give satisfaction?" He laughed at that, as if my answer amused him. "Well, there's nothing like a spice of modesty, Moneylaws," he said. "If you can do all we've just talked of, you'll satisfy me well enough. I like the looks of you, and I'm sure you're the sort that'll do the thing thoroughly. The post's at your disposal, if you'd like to take it." I was struggling with my amazement. £500 a year, and a permanency! It seemed a fortune to a lad of my age, and I was trying to find the right words in which to say all that I felt, when he spoke again. "Look here," he said, "don't let us arrange this as if we'd done it behind your present employer's back. I wouldn't like Mr. Lindsay to think I'd gone behind him to get you. Let it be done this way. I'll call on Mr. Lindsay myself and tell him I'm wanting a steward for the property, and that I've heard good reports of his clerk, and that I'll engage you on his recommendation. He's the sort that would give you a strong word by way of reference, eh?" "Oh, he'll do that, Sir Gilbert," I exclaimed. "Anything that'll help me on." "Then let's leave it at that," he said. "I'll drop in on him at his office, perhaps tomorrow. In the meantime, keep your own counsel. But you'll take my offer?" "I'd be proud and glad to, Sir Gilbert," I said. "And if you'll make allowance for a bit of inexperience, you'll do your best, eh?" he laughed. "That's all right, Moneylaws." He walked out with me to the door and on to the terrace. As I wheeled my bicycle away from the porch, he took a step or two alongside me, his hands in his pockets, his lips humming a careless tune. And suddenly he turned on me. "Have you heard any more about that affair last night?" he asked. "I mean, about Crone." "Nothing, Sir Gilbert," I answered. "I hear that the opinion is the man was struck down by a gaff," he remarked, "and perhaps killed before he was thrown into the Till." "So the doctors seem to think," I said. "And the police, too, I believe." "Aye, well," he said, "I don't know if the police are aware of it, but I'm very sure there's night poaching of salmon going on hereabouts, Moneylaws. I've fancied it for some time, and I've thoughts of talking to the police about it. But you see, my land doesn't touch either Till or Tweed, so I haven't cared to interfere. But I'm sure that it's so, and it wouldn't surprise me if both these men, Crone and Phillips, met their deaths at the hands of the gang I'm thinking of. It's a notion that's worth following up, anyway, and I'll have a word with Murray about it when I'm in the town tomorrow." Then, with a brief good night, he left me and went into the house, and I got outside Hathercleugh and rode home in a whirl of thoughts. And I'll confess readily that those thoughts had little to do with what Sir Gilbert Carstairs had last talked about. They were not so much of Phillips, nor of Crone, nor of his suggestion of a possible gang of night poachers, as about myself and the sudden chance of a great change in my fortunes. For, when all is said and done, we must needs look after ourselves, and when a young man of the age I was then arrived at is asked if he would like to exchange a clerkship of 120 a year for a stewardship at more than 4 times as much as a permanency, you must agree that his mind will fix itself on what such an exchange means to him, to the exclusion of all other affairs. 500 a year to me meant all sorts of fine things: independence, a house of my own, and, not least by a long way, marriage with Maisie Dunlop. And it was a wonder that I managed to keep cool and to hold my tongue when I got home, but hold it I did, and to some purpose, and more than once. During the half hour which I managed to get with Maisie last thing that night, She asked me why I was so silent, and, hard though it was to keep from doing so, I let nothing out. The truth was, Sir Gilbert Carstairs had fascinated me, not only with his grand offer, but with his pleasant, off-hand, companionable manners. He had put me at my ease at once, and had spoken so frankly and with such evident sincerity about his doings on that eventful night, that I accepted every word he said. And, in the little that I had thought of it, I was very ready to accept his theory as to how those two men had come by their deaths, and it was one that was certainly feasible and worth following up. Some years before, I remembered, something of the same sort had gone on, and had resulted in an affray between salmon poachers and river watchers. Why should it not have cropped up again? The more I thought of it, the more I felt Sir Gilbert's suggestion to have reason in it. And in that case all the mystery would be knocked clean out of these affairs. The murder of Phillips, the death of Crone, might prove to be the outcome of some vulgar encounter between them and desperadoes who had subsequently scuttled to safety and were, doubtless, quaking near at hand, in fear of their misdeeds coming to light. What appeared to be a perfect tangle might be the simplest matter in the world. So I judged, and next morning there came news that seemed to indicate that matters were going to be explained on the lines which Sir Gilbert had suggested. Chisholm brought that news to our office just after Mr. Lindsey had come in. He told it to both of us, and from his manner of telling it, we both saw, I perhaps not so clearly as Mr. Lindsey, that the police were already at their favourite trick of going for what seemed to them the obvious line of pursuit. "I'm thinking we've got on the right clue at last as regards the murder of yon man Phillips," announced Chisholm with an air of satisfaction. "And if it is the right clue, as it seems to be, Mr. Lindsey, there'll be no great mystery in the matter after all. Just a plain case of murder for the sake of robbery, that's it." "What's your clue?" asked Mr. Lindsey quietly. "Well," answered Chisholm, with a sort of sly wink, "you'll understand, Mr. Lindsey, that we haven't been doing nothing these last few days since yon inquest on Phillips, you know. As a matter of fact, we've been making inquiries wherever there seemed a chance of finding anything out. And we found something out through one of the banks yonder at Peebles." He looked at us to see if we were impressed. Seeing, at any rate, that we were deeply interested, he went on. "It appears, I'll tell you the story in order, as it were," he said. "It appears that about 8 months ago the agent of the British Linen Bank at Peebles got a letter from one John Phillips, written from a place called Colon in Panama, that's Central America, as you'll be aware, enclosing a draft for £3,000 in the International Banking Corporation of New York. The letter instructed the Peebles agent to collect this sum and to place it in his bank to the writer's credit. Furthermore, it stated that the money was to be there until Phillips came home from Scotland in a few months' time from the date of writing. This, of course, was all done in due course, and there was £3,000 in Phillips's name. There was a bit of correspondence between him at Cologne and the bank at Peebles. Then, at last, he wrote that he was leaving Panama for Scotland, and would call on the bank as soon after his arrival. And on the morning of the day on which he was murdered, Phillips did call at the bank and establish his identity, and so on, and he then drew out £500 of his money, £200 in gold, and the rest in small notes. And, Mr. Lindsey, he carried that sum away with him in a little handbag that he had with him." Mr. Lindsey, who had been listening with great attention, nodded. "Aye," he said, "carried £500 away with him. Go on, then." "Now," continued Chisholm, evidently very well satisfied with himself for the way he was marshalling his facts, "we, that is, to put it plainly, I myself, have been making more searching inquiries about Cornhill and Coldstream. There's two of the men at Cornhill station will swear that when Phillips got out of the train there that evening of the murder, he was carrying a little handbag such as the bank cashier remembers, a small new brown leather bag. They're certain of it. The ticket collector remembers him putting it under his arm while he searched his pocket for his ticket, and, what's more, the landlord of the inn across the bridge there in Coldstream, he remembers the bag clearly enough, and that Phillips never had his hand off of it while he was in his house. And of course, Mr. Lindsey, the probability is that in that bag was the money, just as he had drawn out at the bank." "You've more to tell," remarked Mr. Lindsey. "Just so," replied Chisholm. "And there's two items. First of all, we've found that bag empty, you may be sure in the woods near the old ruin on Tillside, thrown away under a lot of stuff, dead stuff, you'll understand, where it might have lain till doomsday if I hadn't had a most particular search made. But that's not all. The second item is here. The railway folk at Cornhill are unanimous in declaring that by the same train which brought Phillips here, two men, strangers, that looked like tourist gentlemen came as well, whose tickets were from where do you think, then, Mr. Lindsey? Peebles, of course, answered Mr. Lindsey. And you've guessed right, exclaimed Chisholm triumphantly. Peebles it was. And now, how do you think this affair looks? There's so many tourists on Tweedside this time of year that nobody paid any great attention that night to those men, nor where they went. But what could be plainer, do you think? Of course, those two had tracked Phillips from the bank, and they followed him till they had him in yon place where he was found, and they murdered him to rob him. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicole Carl. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 15. 500 a year. It was very evident that Chisholm was in a state of gleeful assurance about his theory, and I don't think he was very well pleased when Mr. Lindsey, instead of enthusiastically acclaiming it as a promising one, began to ask him questions. "You found a pretty considerable sum on Phillips as it was when you searched his body, didn't you?" he asked. "Aye, a good lot," assented Chisholm. "But it was in a pocket book in an inner pocket of his coat, and in his purse." "If it was robbery, why didn't they take everything?" inquired Mr. Lindsey. "Aye, I knew you'd ask that," replied Chisholm. "But the thing is that they were interrupted. Bag they could carry off, but it's probable that they heard Mr. Moneylaws here coming down the lane before they could search the man's pockets." "Umph!" said Mr. Lindsey. "And how do you account for two men getting away from the neighbourhood without attracting attention?" "Easy enough," declared Chisholm. "As I said just now, there's numbers of strangers comes about Tweedside at this time of the year, and who'd think anything of seeing them? What was easier than for these two to separate, to keep close during the rest of the night, and to get away by train from some wayside station or other the next morning? They could manage it easily, and were making inquiries at all the stations in the district on both sides the Tweed, with that idea." "Well, you'll have a lot of people to follow up then," remarked Mr. Lindsey dryly. "If you're going to follow every tourist that got on a train next morning between Berwick and Wooler, and Berwick and Kelso, and Berwick and Bournemouth, and Berwick and Blythe, you'll have your work set, I'm thinking." "All the same," said Chisholm doggedly, "that's how it's been. And the bank at Peebles has the numbers of the notes that Phillips carried off in his little bag, and I'll trace those fellows yet, Mr. Lindsey." "Good luck to you, Sergeant," answered Mr. Lindsey. He turned to me when Chisholm had gone. "That's the police all over, Hugh," he remarked. "And you might talk till you were black in the face to yon man, and he'd stick to his story." "You don't believe it, then?" I asked him, somewhat surprised. "He may be right," he replied. "I'm not saying. Let him attend to his business, and now we'll be seeing to ours." It was a busy day with us in the office that, being the day before court day, we had no time to talk of anything but our own affairs. But during the afternoon, at a time when I had left the office for an hour or two on business, Sir Gilbert Carstairs called, and he was closeted with Mr. Lindsey when I returned. And after they had been together some time, Mr. Lindsey came out to me and beckoned me into a little waiting room that we had, and shut the door on us. And I saw at once from the expression on his face that he had no idea that Sir Gilbert and I had met the night before, or that I had any notion of what he was going to say to me. "Hugh, my lad," he said, clapping me on the shoulder, "you're evidently one of those that are born lucky. What's the old saying? Some achieve greatness, some have greatness thrust upon them. Eh? Here's greatness, in a degree, thrusting itself on you." "What's this you're talking about, Mr. Lindsey?" I asked. "There's not much greatness about me, I'm thinking." "Well, it's not what you're thinking in this case," he answered. "It's what other folks are thinking of you. Here's Sir Gilbert Carstairs in my room yonder. He's wanting a steward, somebody that can keep accounts and letters and look after the estate, and he's been looking round for a likely man, and he's heard that Lindsey's clerk, Hugh Moneylaws, is just the sort he wants, and, in short, the job's yours, if you like to take it. And, my lad, it's worth 500 a year, and a permanency too. Fine chance for a young fellow of your age." "Do you advise me to take it, Mr. Lindsey?" I asked, endeavouring to combine surprise with the proper respect for the value of his counsel. "It's a serious job that, for, as you say, a young man." "Not if he's got your headpiece on him," he replied, giving me another clap on the shoulder. "I do advise you to take it. I've given you the strongest recommendations to him. Go into my office now and talk it over with Sir Gilbert by yourself. But when it comes to settling details, call me in. I'll see you're done right to." I thanked him warmly and went into his room, where Sir Gilbert was sitting in an easy chair. He motioned me to shut the door, and, once that was done, he gave a quick, inquiring look. "You didn't let him know that you and I had talked last night?" he asked at once. "No," I said. "That's right, and I didn't either," he went on. "I don't want him to know I spoke to you before speaking to him. It would look as if I were trying to get his clerk away from it. Well, that's settled then. Moneylaws, you'll take the post?" "I shall be very glad to, Sir Gilbert," said I, "and I'll serve you to the best of my ability, if you'll have a bit of patience with me at the beginning. There'll be some difference between my present job and this you're giving me, but I'm a quick learner and—" "Oh, that's all right, man," he interrupted carelessly. "You'll do all that I want. I hate accounts, and letter writing, and all that sort of thing. Take all that off my hands, and you'll do. Of course, whenever you're in a fix about anything, come to me. But I can explain all there is to do in an hour's talk with you in the beginning. All right, ask Mr. Lindsey to step in to me, and we'll put the matter on a business footing." Mr. Lindsey came in and took over the job of settling matters on my behalf, and the affair was quickly arranged. I was to stay with Mr. Lindsey another month, as to give him the opportunity of getting a new head clerk. Then I was to enter on my new duties at Hathercleugh. I was to have £500 a year salary, with 6 months' notice on either side. At the end of 5 years, if I was still in the situation, the terms were to be revised with a view to an increase, and all this was to be duly set down in black and white. These propositions, of course, were Mr. Lindsey's, and Sir Gilbert assented to all of them readily and promptly. He appeared to be the sort of man who was inclined to accept anything put before him rather than have a lot of talk about it. And presently, remarking that that was all right, and he'd leave Mr. Lindsey to see to it, he rose to go, but at the door he paused and came back. "I'm thinking of dropping in at the police station and telling Murray my ideas about that Crone affair," he remarked. "It's my opinion, Mr. Lindsey, that there's salmon poaching going on hereabouts, and if my land adjoined either Tweed or Till, I'd have spoken about it before. There are queer characters about along both rivers at nights. I know, because I go out a good deal, very late, walking, to try and cure myself of insomnia, and I know what I've seen. It's my impression that Crone was probably mixed up with some gang, and that his death arose out of an affray between them." "That's probable," answered Mr. Lindsey. "There was trouble of that sort some years ago, but I haven't heard of it lately. Certainly it would be a good thing to start the idea in Murray's head. He might follow it up and find something out. That other business, the Phillips murder, might have sprung out of some cause," suggested Sir Gilbert, "if those chaps caught a stranger in a lonely place." "The police have a theory already about Phillips," remarked Mr. Lindsey. "They think he was followed from Peebles and murdered for the sake of money that he was carrying in a bag he had with him. And my experience," he added with a laugh, "is that if the police once get a theory of their own, it's no use suggesting any other to them. They'll ride theirs, either till it drops or they get home with it." Sir Gilbert nodded, as if he agreed with that, and he suddenly gave Mr. Lindsey an inquiring look. "What's your own opinion?" he asked. But Mr. Lindsey was not to be drawn. He laughed and shrugged his shoulders, as if to indicate that the affair was none of his. "I wouldn't say that I have an opinion, Sir Gilbert," he answered. "It's much too soon to form one, and I haven't the details, and I'm not a detective. But all these matters are very simple when you get to the bottom of them. The police think this is going to be a very simple affair. Mere vulgar murder for the sake of mere vulgar robbery. We shall see." Then Sir Gilbert went away, and Mr. Lindsey looked at me, who stood a little apart, and he saw that I was thinking. "Well, my lad," he said, a bit dazed by your new opening, "it's a fine chance for you, too. Now, I suppose, you'll be wanting to get married. Is it that you're thinking about?" "Well, I was not, Mr. Lindsey," said I. "I was just wondering, if you must know, how it was that, as he was here, you didn't tell Sir Gilbert about that signature of his brother's that you found on the Gilverthwaite's will." He shared a sharp look between me and the door, but the door was safely shut. "No," he said. "Neither to him nor anybody yet awhile. And don't you mention that, my lad. Keep it dark till I give the word. I'll find out about that in my own way. You understand on that point, absolute silence." I replied that, of course, I would not say a word, and presently I went into the office to resume my duties. But I had not been long at that before the door opened and Chisholm put his face within and looked at me. "I'm wanting you, Mr. Moneylaws," he said. "You said you were with Crone, buying something, the night before his body was found. You'd be paying him money, and he might be giving you change. Do you happen to see his purse now?" "I answered. "What for do you ask that?" "Because," he said, "we've taken a fellow at one of those riverside publics that's been drinking heavily, and, of course, spending money freely, and he has a queer-looking purse on him, and one or two men that's seen it vows and declares it was Abel Crone's." End of chapter 15. Dead Men's Money.
Chapter 16 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 16. The Man in the Cell. Before I could reply to Chisholm's inquiry, Mr. Lindsey put his head out of his door, and seeing the police sergeant there, asked me what he was after, and when Chisholm had repeated his inquiry, both looked at me. "I did see Crone's purse that night," I answered. "An old thing that he kept tied up with a bootlace, and he'd a lot of money in it, too." "Come round, then, and see if you can identify this that we found on the man," requested Chisholm. "And," he added, turning to Mr. Lindsey, "there's another thing. The man's sober enough, now that we've got him. It's given him a bit of a pull together, being arrested, and he's demanding a lawyer. Perhaps you'll come to him, Mr. Lindsey." "Who is he?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "A Berwick man?" "He isn't," replied Chisholm. "He's a stranger. A fellow that says he was seeking work, and had been stopping at a common lodging-house in the town. He vows and declares that he'd nothing to do with killing Crone, and he's shouting for a lawyer." Mr. Lindsey put on his hat, and he and I went off with Chisholm to the police station. And as we got in sight of it, we became aware that there was a fine to do in the street before its door. The news of the arrest had spread quickly, and folk had come running to get more particulars. And amongst the women and children and loafers that were crowding around was Crone's housekeeper, a great, heavy, rough-haired Irishwoman named Nance Maguire, and she was waving her big arms and shaking her fists at a couple of policemen whom she was adjuring to bring out the murderer so that she might do justice on him then and there. All this being mingled with encomiums on the victim. "The best man that ever lived!" she was screaming at the top of her voice. "The best and kindest creature ever set foot in your murdering town. And didn't I know he was to be done to death by some of ye? And didn't he tell me himself that there was one would give his 2 eyes to be seeing his corpse? And if you've laid hands on him that did it, bring him out to me so, and I'll—" Mr. Lindsey laid a quiet hand on the woman's arm, and twisted her round in the direction of her cottage. "Hold your wisht, good wife, and go home," he whispered to her. "And if you know anything, keep your tongue still till I come to see you. Be away now, and leave it to me." I don't know how it was, but Nance Maguire, after a sharp look at Mr. Lindsey, turned away as meekly as a lamb, and went off, tearful enough, but quiet, down the street, followed by half the rabble, while Mr. Lindsey, Chisholm, and myself turned into the police station. And there we met Mr. Murray, who wagged his head at us as if he were very well satisfied with something. "Not much doubt about this last affair, anyhow," said he, as he took us into his office. You might say the man was caught red-handed. All the same, Mr. Lindsey, he's in his rights to ask for a lawyer, and you can see him whenever you like." "What are the facts?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "Let me know that much first." Mr. Murray jerked his thumb at Chisholm. "The sergeant there knows him," he answered. "He took the man." "It was this way, d'ye see, Mr. Lindsey," said Chisholm, who was becoming an adept at putting statements before people. "You know that bit of public there is along the river yonder, outside the wall, the cod and lobster? Well, James McFarland that keeps it, he came to me, maybe an hour or so ago, and said there was a fellow, a stranger, had been in and out there all day since morning, drinking, and though he wouldn't say the man was what you'd rightly call drunk, still he'd had a skinful, and he was in there again, and they wouldn't serve him, and he was getting quarrelsome and abusive, and in the middle of it had pulled out a purse that another man who was in there vowed and declared, aside, to McFarland, was Abel Crone's. So I got a couple of constables and went back with McFarland, and there was the man vowing he'd be served, and with a handful of money to prove that he could pay for whatever he called for. And as he began to turn ugly and show fight, we just clapped the bracelets on him and brought him along, and there he is in the cells, and, of course, it sobered him down, and he's demanding his rights to see a lawyer." "Who is he?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "A stranger to the town," replied Chisholm, "and he'll neither give name nor address, but to a lawyer, he declares. But we know he was staying at one of the common lodging-houses, Watson's, 3 nights ago, and that the last 2 nights he wasn't in there at all." "Well, where's that purse?" demanded Mr. Lindsey. "Mr. Moneylaws here says he can identify it if it's Crone's." Chisholm opened a drawer and took out what I at once knew to be Abel Crone's purse, which was in reality a sort of old pocket-book or wallet, or some sort of skin, with a good deal of the original hair left on it, and tied about with a bit of old bootlace. There were both gold and silver in it, just as I had seen when Crone pulled it out to find me some change for a 5-shilling piece I had given him, and more by token, there was the 5-shilling piece itself. "That's Crone's purse!" I exclaimed. "I've no doubt about it. And that's a crown piece I gave him myself. I've no doubt about that either." "Let us see the man," said Mr. Lindsey. Chisholm led us down a corridor to the cells and unlocked a door. He stepped within the cell behind it, motioning us to follow, and there, on the one stool which the place contained, sat a big, hulking fellow that looked like a navvy, whose rough clothes bore evidence of his having slept out in them, and whose boots were stained with the mud and clay which they would be likely to collect along the riverside. He was sitting nursing his head in his hands, growling to himself, and he looked up at us as I have seen wild beasts look out through the bars of cages. And somehow there was that in the man's eyes which made me think, there and then, that he was not reflecting on any murder that he had done, but was sullenly and stupidly angry with himself. "Now then, here's a lawyer for you," said Chisholm. "Mr. Lindsey, solicitor." "Well, my man," began Mr. Lindsey, taking a careful look at this queer client, "what have you got to say to me?" The prisoner gave Chisholm a disapproving look. "Not going to say a word before the likes of him," he growled. "I know my rights, governor. What I say, I'll say private to you." "Better leave us, sergeant," said Mr. Lindsey. He waited till Chisholm, a bit unwillingly, had left the cell and closed the door, and then he turned to the man. "Now then," he continued, "you know what they charge you with? You've been drinking hard. Are you sober enough to talk sense? Very well, then. What's this you want me for?" "To defend me, of course," growled the prisoner. He twisted a hand round to the back of his trousers as if to find something. "I've money of my own, a bit put away in a belt," he said. "I'll pay you." "Never mind that now," answered Mr. Lindsey. "Who are you? And what do you want to say?" "Name of John Carter," replied the man. "General labourer, navvy work. Anything of that sort. On tramp, seeking a job. Came here going north night before last, and no more to do with the murder of yon man than you have." "They found his purse on you, anyway," remarked Mr. Lindsey bluntly. "What have you got to say to that?" "What I say is that I'm a damned fool," answered Carter surlily. "It's all against me, I know, but I'll tell you, you can tell lawyers anything. Who's that young fellow?" he demanded suddenly, glaring at me. "I'm not going to talk before no detectives." "My clerk," replied Mr. Lindsey. "Now then, tell your tale, and just remember what a dangerous position you're in." "Know that as well as you do," muttered the prisoner. "But I'm sober enough now. It's this way. I stopped here in the town 3 nights since, and looked about for a job next day. Then I heard of something likely up the river, and went after it, and didn't get it. So I started back here, late at night it was, and after crossing that bridge at a place called Twizel, I turned down to the river bank, thinking to take a short cut, and it was well after dark then, mind you, governor, and come along through the woods, just before where the little river runs into the big one, I come across this man's body, stumbled on it, that's the truth. Well, said Mr. Lindsey, he was lying, I could show you the place easy, between the edge of the wood and the river bank, continued Carter. And though he was dead enough when I found him, governor, he hadn't been dead long, but dead he was, and not from aught of my doing. What time was this? Asked Mr. Lindsey. It would be past 11 o'clock, replied Carter. It was 10 when I called by Cornhill Station. I went the way I did, down through the woods to the river bank, because I had noticed a hut there in the morning that I could sleep in. I was making for that when I found the body. Well, about the purse? Demanded Mr. Lindsey shortly. No lies now. The prisoner shook his head at that and growled, but it was evident he was growling at himself. That's right enough, he confessed. I felt in his pockets, and I did take the purse, but I didn't put him in the water. True as I'm here, governor, I did no more than take the purse. I left him there, just as he was, and the next day I got drinking, and last night I stopped in that hut again, and today I was drinking pretty heavy, and I sort of lost my head and pulled the purse out, and that's the truth, anyway, whether you believe it or not. But I didn't kill yon man, though I'll admit I robbed his body, like the fool I am. Well, you'll see where it's landed you, remarked Mr. Lindsey. All right, hold your tongue now, and I'll see what I can do. I'll appear for you when you come before the magistrate tomorrow. He tapped at the door of the cell, and Chisholm, who had evidently waited in the corridor, let us out. Mr. Lindsey said nothing to him nor to the superintendent. He led me away into the street, and there he clapped me on the arm. I believe every word that man said, he murmured. Come on now, we'll see this Nance Maguire. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Savage, Waco, Texas, May 2007. Dead Men's Money by J.S. Fletcher. Chapter 17. The Irish Housekeeper. I was a good deal surprised that Mr. Lindsey should be, apparently, so anxious to interview Crone's housekeeper, and I said as much. He turned on me sharply, with a knowing look. "Didn't you hear what the woman was saying when we came across her there, outside the police station?" he exclaimed. "She was saying that Crone had said to her that there was some man who would give his 2 eyes to be seeing his corpse. Crone's been telling her something, and I'm so convinced that that man in the cells yonder has told us the truth, as regards himself, that I'm going to find out what Crone did tell her. Who is there, who could there be that wanted to see Crone's dead body? Let's try to find that out." I made no answer, but I was beginning to think, and to wonder too, in a vague, not very pleasant fashion. Was this, Crone's death, murder, whatever it was, at all connected with the previous affair of Phillips? Had Crone told me the truth that night I went to buy the stuff for Tom Dunlop's rabbit hutches? Or had he kept something back? And while I was reflecting on these points, Mr. Lindsey began talking again. "I watched that man closely when he was giving me his account of what happened," he said, "and as I said just now, I believe he told us the truth. Whoever it was that did Crone to death, he's not in that cell, Hugh, my lad, and unless I'm much mistaken, all this is of a piece with Phillips's murder. But let's hear what this Irishwoman has to say." Crone's cottage was a mean, miserable, shanty sort of place, down a narrow alley in a poor part of the town. When we reached its door there was a group of women and children round it, all agog with excitement. But the door itself was closed, and it was not opened to us till Nance Maguire's face had appeared at the bit of window, and Nance had assured herself of the identity of her visitors. And when she had let us in, she shut the door once more, and slipped a bolt into its socket. "I ain't said a word, your honour," said she, "since your honour told me not to, though them outside is sharp on me to tell 'em this and that. And I wouldn't have said what I did up yonder had I known your honour would be for supporting me. I was feeling there wasn't a soul in the place would see justice done for them that's gone, the poor, good man." "If you want justice, my good woman," remarked Mr. Lindsey, "keep your tongue quiet, and don't talk to your neighbours, nor to the police. Just keep anything you know till I tell you to let it out. Now then, what's this you were saying? That Crone told you there was a man in the place would give his 2 eyes to see him a corpse?" "Them very words, your honour, "and not once nor twice, but a good many times did he say it," replied the woman. "It was a sort of hint he was giving me, your honour. He had that way of speaking." "Since when did he give you such hints?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "Was it only lately?" "It was since that other bloody murder, your honour," said Nance Maguire. "Only since then. He would talk of it as we sat over the fire there at nights. 'There's murder in the air,' says he. 'Bloody murder is all around us,' he says, 'and it's myself will have to pick my steps careful,' he says, 'for there's him about would give his two eyes to see me a stark and staring corpse,' he says. 'Me knowin',' he says, 'more than you'd give me credit for,' says he, and not another word than them could I get out of him, your honour." "He never told you who the man was that he had fears of?" inquired Mr. Lindsey. "He did not then, your honour," replied Nance. "He was a close man, and you wouldn't be getting more out of him than he liked to tell." "Now then, just tell me the truth about a thing or two," said Mr. Lindsey. "Crone used to be out at nights now and then, didn't he?" "Indeed, then, he did so, your honour," she answered readily. "'Tis true, he would be out at nights, now and again." "Poaching, as a matter of fact," suggested Mr. Lindsey. "And that's the truth, your honour," she assented. "He was a clever hand with the rabbits." "Aye, but did he never bring home a salmon, now?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "Come, out with it." "I'll not deny that neither, your honour," admitted the woman. "He was clever at that too." "Well, now, about that night when he was supposed to be killed," continued Mr. Lindsey, "that's Tuesday last, this being Thursday. Did he ever come home that evening from his shop?" I had been listening silently all this time, and I listened with redoubled attention for the woman's answer to the last question. It was on the Tuesday evening, about 9 o'clock, that I had had my talk with Crone, and I was anxious to know what happened after that. And Nance Maguire replied readily enough. It was evident her memory was clear on these events. "He did not, then," she said. "He was in here having his tea at 6 o'clock that evening, and he went away to the shop when he'd had it, and I never put my eyes on him again alive, your honour. He was never home that night, and he didn't come to his breakfast next morning, and he wasn't at the shop, and I never heard this or that of him till they'd come and tell me the bad news." I knew then what must have happened. After I had left him, Crone had gone away up the river towards Tilmouth. He had a crazy old bicycle that he rode about on, and most people, having heard Nance Maguire's admissions, would have said that he had gone poaching. But I was not so sure of that. I was beginning to suspect that Crone had played some game with me, and had not told me anything like the truth during our conversation. There had been more within his knowledge than he had let out, but what was it? And I could not help feeling that his object in setting off in that direction, immediately after I had left him, might have been, not poaching, but somebody to whom he wished to communicate the result of his talk with me. And in that case, who was the somebody? But just then I had to leave my own thoughts and speculations alone, and to attend to what was going on between my principal and Nance Maguire. Mr. Lindsey, however, appeared to be satisfied with what he had heard. He gave the woman some further advice about keeping her tongue still, told her what to do as regards Crone's effects, and left the cottage. And when we were out in the main street again on our way back to the office, he turned to me with a look of decision. "I've come to a definite theory about this affair, Hugh," he said, "and I'll lay a fiver to a farthing that it's the right one." "Yes, Mr. Lindsey?" said I, keenly interested at hearing that. "Crone knew who killed Phillips," he said, "and the man who killed Phillips killed Crone too, because Crone knew. That's been the way of it, my lad. And now then, who's the man?" I could make no reply to such a question, and presently he went on, talking as much to himself, I think, as to me. "I wish I knew certain things," he muttered. "I wish I knew what Phillips and Gilverthwaite came here for. I wish I knew if Gilverthwaite ever had any secret dealings with Crone. I do wish I knew if there is a third man in this Phillips Gilverthwaite affair who has managed, and is managing, to keep himself in the background. But I'll stake my professional reputation on one thing. Whoever killed Phillips killed Abel Crone. It's all of a piece. Now, of course I know now, have known for many a year, that it was at this exact juncture that I made a fatal, a reprehensible mistake in my share of all this business. It was there, at that exact point, that I ought to have made a clean breast to Mr. Lindsey of everything that I knew. I ought to have told him, there and then, of what I had seen at the crossroads that night of the murder of Phillips, and of my conversation about that with Abel Crone at his shop, and of my visit to Sir Gilbert Carstairs at Hathercleugh House. Had I done so, matters would have become simplified, and much more horror and trouble avoided, for Mr. Lindsey was just then at the beginning of a straight track, and my silence turned him away from it, to get into more twisted and obscure ones. But I said nothing. And why? The answer is simple, and there's the excuse of human nature in it. I was so much filled with the grand prospects of my stewardship, and of all it would bring me, and was so highly pleased with Sir Gilbert Carstairs for his advancement of my fortunes, that, here's the plain truth, I could not bring myself to think of, or bother with, anything else. Up to then, of course, I had not said a word to my mother or to Maisie Dunlop of the stewardship. I was impatient to tell both. So I held my peace and said nothing to Mr. Lindsey, and presently the office work for the day was over, and I was free to race home with my grand news. Is it likely that with such news as that I would be troubling my head any longer about other folks' lives and deaths? That, I suppose, was the most important evening I had ever spent in my life. To begin with, I felt as if I had become suddenly older and bigger and much more important. I became inclined to adopt magisterial airs to my mother and my sweetheart, laying down the law to them as to the future in a fashion which made Maisie poke fun at me for a crowing cockerel. It was only natural that I should suffer a little from a swelled head that night. I should not have been human otherwise. But Andrew Dunlop took the conceit out of me with a vengeance when Maisie and I told him the news, and I explained everything to him in his back parlour. He was at times a man of many words, and at times a man of few words, and when he said little, he meant most. "Aye," said he, "well, that's a fine prospect, Hugh, my man, and I wish you well in it. But there'll be no talk of any wedding for 2 years, so get that notion out of your heads, both of you. In 2 years you'll just have got settled to your new job, and you'll be finding out how you suit your master and how he suits you. We'll get the preliminaries over, and see how things promise in that time. And we'll see, too, how much money you've saved out of your salary, my man, so you'll just not hear the wedding bells calling for a couple of 12 months, and'll behave yourselves like good children in the meanwhile. There's a deal of things may happen in 2 years, I'm thinking." He might have added that a deal of things may happen in 2 weeks, and indeed he would have had good reason for adding it, could he have looked a few days ahead. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of Dead Men's Money. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dead Men's Money by J. S. Fletcher. Chapter 18. The Ice Axe. The police put Carter in the dock before a full bench of magistrates next morning, and the court was so crowded that it was all Mr. Lindsey and I could do to force our way to the solicitors' table. Several minor cases came on before Carter was brought up from the cells, and during this hearing I had leisure to look around the court and see who was there. And almost at once I saw Sir Gilbert Carstairs, who, though not yet a justice of the peace, his commission to that honourable office arrived a few days later, oddly enough, had been given a seat on the bench, in company with 1 or 2 other local dignitaries, one of whom I observed with some curiosity was that Reverend Mr. Ridley who had given evidence at the inquest on Phillips. All these folks, it was easy to see, were in a high state of inquisitiveness about Crone's murder, and from certain whispers that I overheard I gathered that the chief cause of this interest lay in a generally accepted opinion that it was, as Mr. Lindsey had declared to me more than once, all of a piece with the crime of the previous week, and it was very easy to observe that they were not so curious to see Carter as to hear what might be alleged against him. There appeared to be some general surprise when Mr. Lindsey quietly announced that he was there on behalf of the prisoner. You would have thought from the demeanour of the police that, in their opinion, there was nothing for the bench to do but hear a bit of evidence and commit Carter straight away to the assizes to take his trial for wilful murder. What evidence they did bring forward was, of course, plain and straightforward enough. Crone had been found lying in a deep pool in the River Till, but the medical testimony showed that he had met his fate by a blow from some sharp instrument, the point of which had penetrated the skull and the frontal part of the brain in such a fashion as to cause instantaneous death. The man in the dock had been apprehended with Crone's purse in his possession. Therefore, said the police, he had murdered and robbed Crone. As I say, Mr. Murray and all of them, as you could see, were quite of the opinion that this was sufficient, and I am pretty sure that the magistrates were of the same way of thinking. And the police were not over well pleased, and the rest of the folk in court were, to say the least, a little mystified when Mr. Lindsey asked a few questions of 2 witnesses, of whom Chisholm was one, and the doctor who had been fetched to Crone's body the other. And before setting down what questions they were that Mr. Lindsey asked, I will remark here that there was a certain something, a sort of mysterious hinting in his manner of asking them, that suggested a lot more than the mere questions themselves, and made people begin to whisper amongst each other that Lawyer Lindsey knew things that he was not just then minded to let out. It was to Chisholm that he put his first questions, casually, as if they were very ordinary ones, and yet with an atmosphere of meaning behind them that excited curiosity. "You made a very exhaustive search of the neighbourhood of the spot where Crone's body was found, didn't you?" he inquired. "A thorough search," answered Chisholm. "You found the exact spot where the man had been struck down?" "Judging by the marks of the blood, yes." "On the river bank, between the river and a coppice, wasn't it?" "Just so, between the bank and the coppice." "How far had the body been dragged before it was thrown into the river?" "10 yards," replied Chisholm promptly. "Did you notice any footprints?" asked Mr. Lindsey. "It would be very difficult to trace any," explained Chisholm. "The grass is very thick in some places, and where it isn't thick, it's that close and wiry in texture that a boot wouldn't make any impression." "One more question," said Mr. Lindsey, leaning forward and looking Chisholm full in the face. "When you charged the man there in the dock with the murder of Abel Crone, did he at once, instantly, show you the greatest surprise? Come now, on your oath, yes or no?" "Yes," admitted Chisholm, "he did." "But he just as readily admitted he was in possession of Crone's purse. Again, yes or no?" "Yes," said Chisholm. "Yes, that's so." That was all Mr. Lindsey asked Chisholm. It was not much more that he asked the doctor. But there was more excitement about what he did ask him, arising out of something that he did in asking it. "There's been talk, doctor, as to what the precise weapon was which caused the fatal injury to this man Crone," he said. "It's been suggested that the wound which occasioned his death might have been, and probably was, caused by a blow from a salmon gaff. What is your opinion?" "It might have been," said the doctor cautiously. "It was certainly caused by a pointed weapon, some sort of a spiked weapon?" suggested Mr. Lindsey. "A sharp, pointed weapon, most certainly," affirmed the doctor. "There are other things than a salmon gaff that, in your opinion, could have caused it?" "Oh, of course," said the doctor. Mr. Lindsey paused a moment and looked around the court as if he were thinking over his next question. Then he suddenly plunged his hand under the table at which he was standing, and amidst a dead silence drew out a long, narrow, brown paper parcel which I had seen him bring to the office that morning. Quietly, while the silence grew deeper and the interest stronger, he produced from this an object such as I had never seen before, an implement or weapon about 3 feet in length, its shaft made of some tough but evidently elastic wood, furnished at one end with a strong iron ferrule, and at the other with a steel head, one extremity of which was shaped like a carpenter's adze, while the other tapered off to a fine point. He balanced this across his open palms for a moment, so that the court might see it. Then he passed it over to the witness box. "Now, doctor," he said, "look at that, which is one of the latest forms of an ice axe. Could that wound have been caused by that, or something very similar to it?" The witness put a forefinger on the sharp point of the head. "Certainly," he answered. "It is much more likely to have been caused by such an implement as this than by a salmon gaff." Mr. Lindsey reached out his hand for the ice axe, and reposing himself of it, passed it and the brown paper wrapping to me. "Thank you, doctor," he said. "That's all I wanted to know." He turned to the bench. "I wish to ask your worships if it is your intention, on the evidence you have heard, to commit the prisoner on the capital charge today?" he asked. "If it is, I shall oppose such a course. What I do ask, knowing what I do, is that you should adjourn this case for a week, when I shall have some evidence to put before you which, I think, will prove that this man did not kill Abel Crone." There was some discussion. I paid little attention to it, being considerably amazed at the sudden turn with which things had taken, and astonished altogether by Mr. Lindsey's production of the ice axe. But the discussion ended in Mr. Lindsey having his own way, and Carter was remanded in custody, to be brought up again a week later. and presently we were all out in the streets, in groups, everybody talking excitedly about what had just taken place, and speculating on what it was that Lawyer Lindsey was after. Mr. Lindsey himself, however, was more imperturbable, and, if anything, cooler than usual. He tapped me on the arm as we went out of court, and at the same time took the parcel containing the ice axe from me. "Hugh," he said, "there is nothing more to do today, and I'm going out of town at once until tomorrow. You can lock up the office now, and you and the other two can take a holiday. I'm going straight home, and then to the station." He turned hurriedly away in the direction of his house, and I went off to the office to carry out his instructions. There is nothing strange in his giving us a holiday. It was a thing he often did in summer on fine days when we had nothing much to do, and this was a gloriously fine day, and the proceedings in court had been so short that it was not yet noon. So I packed off the two junior clerks and the office lad and locked up, and went away myself, and in the street outside I met Sir Gilbert Carstairs. He was coming along in our direction, evidently deep in thought, and he started a little as he looked up and saw me. "Hello, Moneylaws!" he said in his offhand fashion. "I was just wanting to see you, I say," he went on, laying a hand on my arm. "You're dead certain that you've never mentioned to a soul but myself anything about that affair of yours and Crone's? You know what I mean." "Absolutely certain, Sir Gilbert," I answered. "There's no living being knows but yourself." "That's all right," he said, and I could see he was relieved. "I don't want mixing up with these matters. I should very much dislike it. What's Lindsey trying to get at in his defence of this man Carter?" "I can't think," I replied, "unless it is that he's now inclining to the theory of the police that Phillips was murdered by some man or men who followed him from Peebles, and that the same man or men murdered Crone. I think that must be it. There were some men, tourists about, who haven't been found yet." He hesitated a moment, then glanced at our office door. "Lindsey in?" he asked. "No, Sir Gilbert," I replied. "He's gone out of town and given us a holiday." "Oh," he said, looking at me with a sudden smile. "You've got a holiday, have you, Moneylaws? Look here, I'm going for a run in my bit of a yacht. Come with me. How soon can you be ready?" "As soon as I've taken my dinner, Sir Gilbert," I answered, pleased enough at the invitation. "Would an hour do?" "You needn't bother about your dinner," he said. "I'm having a lunch basket packed now at the hotel, and I'll step in and tell them to put in enough for two. Go and get a good thick coat, and meet me down at the front in half an hour." I ran off home, told my mother where I was going, and hurried away to the riverside. The Tweed was like a mirror flashing back the sunlight that day, and out beyond its mouth the open sea was bright and blue as the sky above. How could I foresee that out there in those far off dancing waters there was awaiting me of which I can only think now, when it is long past, with fear and horror. End of chapter 18.